Hello and welcome to World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, U.S. President Donald Trump begins his Marathon Asia tour in Japan before visiting South Korea and the Philippines. How can Trump reassure commitment to longtime Asian allies that he once vowed to abandon during his campaign trail? I speak with a Chinese indie filmmaker on his comedy Free and Easy, and we also talk about what are the challenges of tapping into the huge Chinese film market. And let's begin our program in Japan, which is the first stop of U.S. President Donald Trump's Asia tour. Trump and the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe are holding a series of meetings aimed at underscoring the strength of U.S.-Japanese alliance. Trump will also travel to other allied countries such as South Korea and the Philippines later.
It's his longest foreign trip as U.S. president, but Donald Trump won't be taking a big policy-making entourage along for the ride. 10 months into his presidency, Trump is still formulating his strategies for the Asia-Pacific. Much like his predecessor, Barack Obama, Trump is taking his time. In fact, it wasn't until 3 years after he won the White House that Obama announced his so-called pivot to Asia.
The United States is turning our attention to the vast potential of the Asia-Pacific region.
And yet, in Trump's administration, there are many open positions for a region that is supposed to be a U.S. priority. Trump has yet to appoint U.S. ambassadors to Australia and the Republic of Korea. Top Asia policy jobs in defense and diplomacy also remain vacant. Asia expert Cheng Li of the Brookings Institution says that's a problem.
You look at the history, Nixon has Kissinger, Jimmy Carter has Brzezinski, and Bush Jr. has Hank Paulson. You need a heavyweight person to coordinate this policy.
Trump has no such coordinator for Asia affairs, and Lee says so far 3 different officials have spearheaded economic initiatives between the U.S. and China. Sam Zhou with the Center for China-U.S. Cooperation recalls when U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson first visited Beijing in March, the size of the Chinese delegation eclipsed the American one.
There is an imbalance here, so that's why I think China and both China and the U.S. should be aware of this situation.
Without a policy team, Trump appears to be making decisions based on personal relationships with Chinese President Xi Jinping and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. The DPRK's weapons program will likely come up in at least one of Trump's 2 major speeches in Asia, one to the Republic of Korea's National Assembly, the other to Asia-Pacific CEOs in Vietnam.
For more on President Trump's first Asian tour, we are joined in our Beijing studio by Mr. Teng Jianqun, who is the director of the Department of American Studies with the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, sir. Also in Beijing, we have Rick Dunham, seasoned journalist, certainly, and co-director of the Global Business Journalism Program at Tsinghua University, originally Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief of Houston Chronicle. Welcome, sir. And in Tokyo, Japan, we are honored also to have Mr. Takesato Watanabe, Professor Emeritus at Doshisha University. Professor, welcome to our show. How much should we expect to be achieved this time by President Trump to Asia? I want to start with Rick to help us understand the picture and the temperature from Washington.
Well, the temperature is very high in Washington when it comes to scandal. You had 2 indictments of top campaign officials and a guilty plea from a foreign policy advisor this week. And so the news in Washington this whole week has been about scandal. And so Donald Trump has had trouble focusing American public opinion. In one way, that's good for him, in that the expectations are low, because it's a very, very important trip. The U.S. relationship with China is obviously pivotal to the world, the largest 2 economies, and the relationship between and among the United States, Japan, China, and the Koreas. And so I think the key things we're hearing out of the White House are very positive about China, about working with China, about how China is the key to Asian security in the 21st century.
Professor Watanabe, Japan is going to be the first stop for the Asia tour. Longtime ally, but things have not been necessarily in, shall I say, great melody between Tokyo and Washington, D.C. over the past 1 year or so. Much can be achieved?
When I see the schedule of Mr. Trump's in Asia, for Japan 3 days, for South Korea 2 days, China 3 days, then other Vietnam, Philippines 1 day each. This means that for Mr. Trump, Japan is very important, and China is more important because he has to have the full support from Japan before going to China. And for him, the South Korea is the place where he can say hello only. So in this sense, Japan is very important because without Japanese support, Mr. Trump cannot say the strong words for President Xi Jinping, because Mr. Xi Jinping, President, and Mr. Trump of the United States, he thinks, I believe that both two nations can control in the long run of the world.
Well, whether you believe that or not is a big question mark, Mr. Teng. How does China see the schedule of President Trump's visit to East Asia, Northeast Asia? And how does China see the U.S. relationship these days with its allies, Japan and South Korea?
Of course, different countries have different anticipations toward this visit by President Donald Trump. And in terms of the relations between China and the United States, I'm sure Chinese government and our leaders have already attached great importance to this visit. This is really a very important visit to maintain the stable relations between the two sides. And we have witnessed some development or promotions in the relation in recent months, especially after the April meeting this year. This is a political foundation for the two countries to develop its economic cooperation and security cooperation in regional affairs and in bilateral affairs. So I think the two sides, especially Chinese government, gave a great importance to this visit.
Right, but having said all of these diplomatic words, I think there are several things that all sides will concentrate on during this President Trump's visit to Northeast Asian countries. One is the Korean Peninsula nuclear crisis. The other is trade and economic ties among all in the Asia-Pacific region, including latter his APEC summit tour. And thirdly is what kind of region, what kind of world are we shaping right now? I guess these issues will be in the front line and also in the backroom discussion as well. Let's tackle them one by one. On the Korean Peninsula issue, Rick, you know better than all of us that in Washington there were originally different voices, and now probably even more diversified about how to deal with whether military action or not. What is the role of China in this regard? How should the United States work on dialogue and discussion with the DPRK? To what extent can they go public about the content of the discussion? Rick, could you help us? What stakes can President Trump bring with him in his hand?
Well, he actually has a lot of leverage. Part of it is because he's been so extreme so far, fire and fury, saying that there's no use to have a Secretary of State talk to the North Koreans. It gives him a chance, if he can figure out a diplomatic overture that is okay with China and Japan, to move ahead. But the problem is you have to act in unison, and the provocative attempts by North Korea to launch missiles have driven a wedge between China and the U.S. because of the missile defense system and Chinese opposition to the Americans and South Koreans deploying a missile defense system.
Mr. Teng, now we see some real development. South Korea, for example, the president have already said that there's no further installment of launchers of that system. He also said that no military action could take place on the Korean Peninsula without the notification and the approval of South Korea. I guess people are very clear as to who he is referring this to. So Mr. Tang, with all these new developments, what space does it leave to President Trump to come to consensus with the Chinese side and also with the allies, including South Korea?
Yeah, there are some differences in the approaches to find a solution of the dilemma in Korean Peninsula. And I think China's main interest is to maintain the peace and the stability in this region. It's a condition for the Chinese domestic development. And after the 19th CPC National Congress, I'm sure all the reforms, including political reform, economic reform, and military reform, will move on the faster track. And this is the driving force for China to continue its effort in maintaining the peace and the stability in this region. And in terms of ROK, I think President Moon Jae-in has adopted a very different policy toward DPRK, toward the United States. And Moon Jae-in would like to have more balanced relations with all the powers concerned, all the countries concerned, and to avoid any escalation of the crisis. This is the main purpose for ROK and for President Moon Jae-in. And in terms of the United States, I think we haven't got any clear-cut vision assessment on the policy by Donald Trump toward the DPRK. Sometimes the policy from the United States just responsive, just gave some response to the missile test and the nuclear test by DPRK. So it seems to us that all the parties concerned would like to return to the original point, that is to negotiate a peaceful and stable solution to the nuclear issue in Peninsula.
Well said, but at the very beginning of the trip, we don't want to forget President Trump need to visit Tokyo, Japan, with strong consensus, apparently, Professor Watanabe, that Prime Minister Abe has got with his re-election, even though he's not the favorite, but the Japanese voters do not have many other choices, so he's still there as the Prime Minister. So he's got strong consensus about how to push forward his policies this time with another term. Originally, Japan said that it would support military action when necessary to the United States when the U.S. decided to go with the military approach on the Korean Peninsula crisis. So Professor Watanabe, who is going to persuade whom during President Trump's visit to Tokyo? How is the public in any way, who could be quite passive still at this point in Japan, be able to influence any decision made in that regard?
They are keenly concerned with the change of the Constitution, Clause 9. They are against it. However, Mr. Abe is so keenly concerned on this matter to put it on the first item of the political discussions. But for the visit of Mr. Trump, he is not preparing anything for these things because during 3 days visit in Japan, both of them play golf, and Mr. Abe and President Trump meet the family of whose children were kidnapped by North Korea. And also, Mr. Trump meets Emperor Hirohito, and these are diplomatic events, but they are not practical issues between the two countries. It means that Mr. Trump has no problem with Mr. Abe, who is following 100% to Mr. Trump's requests and ideas. It means that Japan should buy more military weapons, and also Japan should say always yes to all the questions raised by Mr. Trump. This is the reality that many media in Japan are criticizing Mr. Abe this time. And also, the reason why Mr. Abe got the overwhelming majority of the lower house is that Japan should be very careful against DPRK. So DPRK is a supporter for Mr. Abe in a sense. This is very cynical, but this is true.
Having said that, though, what about the South Korea? I mean, at this point, Mr. Tang, South Korea has made actions and rhetorics, as we mentioned. But when it comes to South Korea's negotiating power with Washington, we all understand the balance. What is likely to be the weight that the South Korean president is going to put on this time about the future direction of things on the Korean Peninsula?
Generally speaking, I don't think President Moon Jae-in has large room in promoting the initiatives proposed by the president, and especially in dealing with the relations between ROK and the United States. And for example, during the Berlin meeting, Moon Jae-in also gave some initiative to the peace and stability in Korean Peninsula, but denied by DPRK and also denied by the United States. The two countries were not interested in the proposal given by Moon Jae-in because the two countries, I mean the United States and the DPRK, both have their own specific interest in this game. This is actually this is not a technical issue. This is actually a political competition among the main powers in this region. And Kim Jong-un actually almost has already got the nuclear and the missile technology. And at this moment, no one can stop it because he would like to possess such a capability. And he would like to be a nuclear power state. And after that, he would like to have some negotiations with China, with the United States on nuclear disarmament.
That could be the future picture that we are looking at. But for now, what is this trip going to mean for President Trump's looking for a clear idea that he could show to the public about the approach to deal with the crisis on the Korean Peninsula? How much political stake does this trip, Mr. Dunham, carry for him as the president of the United States? As you mentioned earlier, he's got a lot of things on his hand right now. So what does he need to achieve in order to be there?
Well, scandal will be there before and after, but this is a real opportunity for him if he can. What Donald Trump likes is to bring something real back. So some sort of an agreement, some sort of a consensus. That's a lot easier said than done. And I think because I think he could reach a consensus or agreement with President Xi Jinping, but all four of the leaders, that's going to be a challenge. And failure will just make him look bad in a situation where he's been looking weak domestically because he's not getting things through Congress, and you've had the indictment. So I think the stakes, political stakes, are high for Donald Trump if it looks like his political weakness in the United States is hurting him both economically and diplomatically in East Asia.
But also the other way around. If he could bring something back home that he could portray in a way to his constituency as well as Washington about achievements, he could reestablish his image and also his political power to a certain extent with all of these things going on.
I think that would be big. If he could come up with some sort of agreement that he and President Xi Jinping could announce, that would be a big political boost back home.
And of course, China is thinking about the state visit plus kinds of treatment toward President Trump. A lot of respect for President Trump as the president of the United States, of course. Having said that, though, one thing needs to be very much touched on, that is trade. Trade has been in the original campaigns of President Trump earlier. And he has certainly made his attitude very clear, whether it's about TPP, the WTO, or some of the other things. Mr. Dunham, what could be portrayed as a victory for him during his trip to Asia on trade? Of course, when I say victory, it has to be something that everybody else agrees, because trade, you cannot just do it alone.
Correct. I think it will focus on China, even though during the campaign he criticized all three countries and said that the U.S. had made bad deals with all of them. But I think Japan will try to avoid any conflict on economic issues. Korea will want to focus on their security. I think in China there's an opportunity, some sort of opening. I mean, President Xi Jinping talked about it last week. The Communist Party meetings talked about opening the economy. I think it's
Reform
practical.
And opening up as
That's
a whole
correct.
phrase.
So something practical that Donald Trump could point to. A few months ago there was Texas beef. American beef could be imported, and that's something that every American understands, the hamburger. So something like that, whether it is Citibank or Facebook or
I'm not sure
something.
Citibank is really something every American would really
would agree
understand.
on. Maybe McDonald's.
We don't know. But what about you? Of course, that's a joke. Mr. Teng, concrete things that would benefit both sides when you look at the bigger picture come to trade.
Yeah, I think the relation between the two countries have already reached a new era. And for example, in economic cooperation or trade cooperation, actually China would like to open more, in its economic sector and also in some other sectors to, promote the relations. And we proposed recently to the function department that we should not only focus on the consumer goods. We should, focus our attention on the capital goods. This is a very important, large area for the two countries to cooperate. For example, the investment, the exchanges of personnel, especially the specific scientists or engineers. We have a lot of advantages in this regard. So we can exchange, have a new cooperation. This is a very important area. But today, we have not so much cooperation in this regard. So
I'm
I
not
think
sure whether the trip would cover all of these areas.
But I'm sure President Donald Trump will get something. For example, we have already known that in ROK, Moon Jae-in will give him about $4 billion military purchase, especially for aircraft and fighting vessels.
Right.
So this is a big deal. And of course in Japan, I'm sure Japan will give some military transfer. And China, no military transfer, but I think agriculture cooperation and the capital goods cooperation. Some said the economic cooperation, the function, of the economic cooperation between the two sides, used to be stabilizer, but now the function has been reduced sharply just because of the fast development of China. And China today would like to be a banker, not only a T-shirt sailor. Right. So they said that...
So what is your opinion?
I think we still have a large room, a lot of sectors to be open for the cooperation, especially in trade and in economic area.
Having said that, my final point to ask all of you is about strategically, what are we going to be looking at with this trip to the region? Earlier, with the Obama administration, there was so-called rebalance to Asia, and that has not created positive ramifications throughout the years. And now, before the trip, we also heard about so-called the Indo-Pacific and concept from the Trump administration, talking about the importance of Japan, India, vis-a-vis China. Are we going to see another controversial concept being raised at this time during the trip? Is this going to bother the region for both the midterm and the longer term? I think that is a fundamental question we need to discuss. But real briefly from you, Mr. Dunham.
Well, I do think we will hear more of this Indo-Pacific pivot from the Trump people, but not this week. This is not the week when you're in East Asia to be bringing India and Pakistan in.
Mr. Teng?
I think this visit by President Donald Trump will give a new driving forces for the development of a relation between China and the United States. For example, new regions will be formed by the two countries, by the two presidents, to give a new direction and a new way to go for the future. And the cooperation in various areas, for example, the economy and in culture and security, also will be promoted because the two leaders have already realized the importance to cooperate.
So you do not think there's likely to be another concept attempted by some to bring into the strategic vision about how to deal with the region that would harm China-U.S. relations?
This is a long debate in the United States, whether to deter China or contain China or to engage China.
Certainly challenges ahead, but this is going to be a very exciting week for all of us here in Northeast Asia, and the world's attention is certainly on us. Thank you so much, Teng Jianqun, Rick Dunham, Takesato Watanabe. Really appreciate it.